Okay, welcome to Module 5.2, North Africa and Southwest Asia. And one point that we should start with, excuse me, is actually the terminology here. What we're going to be talking about is what most people consider the Middle East. But that's really a very precise term because, in fact, the region extends all the way to Western Sahara in the west and as far as Iran in the east. And so, excuse me, it's a region that covers far greater area than simply the small Middle Eastern section. So, again, what we're going to be talking about today is, in fact, defining the region, some very important physiographic features that really play into today's news media, and they're worth understanding where they are and what they are. And then the historical landscape, religion in the region, settlement, conflict, and of course, petroleum. And we'll be returning to that one again and again. All right, so when we look at the region again, what we're really talking about is the margins of the Sahara Desert on Africa, and then the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the areas south of the Caspian and Black Sea in terms of the Eurasian land mass. When we think about this then, what I want you to understand are kind of the key features and how they relate to some of the other important world and geopolitical issues. So let's tear this area apart here. First of all, within North Africa, the main concepts that are worth noting in terms of where they are is, first of all, what we call the Straits of Gibraltar right here, and then what we have north of the Sahara Desert is this band of what we call the Atlas Mountains, and broadly speaking, this is also the Maghreb region. What you should note along this far northern margin is this area that's fairly green. Remember, this is an NDVI image, and so the area that I've just drawn a line through is in fact this coastal area in northwest Africa that is fairly productive in terms of olives, citrus, and grapes. Although, again, although Tunisia does produce some pretty good wine, it's not a very large wine producer, in part because of the Islamic culture. Now, as we move eastward, the next major concept that I want you to understand is this relationship between North Africa, Southwest Asia, and of course this large water body through here that we call the Mediterranean Sea. So oftentimes when we talk about the Mediterranean Sea or the Mediterranean Fleet, which is something that the United States is often involved in, it is this fairly narrow water body between Europe and Africa that we're talking about. The next piece that I want you to note is the Nile River. And the Nile River is what we call an eccentric river, meaning that we can see that it's a very green, you'll notice here's the Nile Delta, and then this very long, in fact the longest river in the world, snaking, well, a little bit off there, snaking across the Sahara Desert. We call it an eccentric river because throughout much of its course there's no water being added to it. In fact, it's losing water as it goes. And then we have, again, this major area here, and this is the Red Sea. And in fact, the Red Sea is also a rifting zone where continents are pulling apart. So here's the Red Sea, and here is the Gulf of Aden. So we often talk about these two areas, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, in terms of incredibly important geopolitical areas. This big piece of land here is, in fact, the Arabian Peninsula. And so the Red Sea is the water body on the southwest of the Arabian Peninsula, the Mediterranean on the northwest, Gulf of Aden, and in fact the Indian Ocean on the south and east portion. And then, let's get to the next slide, what we see on the other side is in fact the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. Now, the Persian Gulf, essentially being this whole area through here, is what allows access to many of the very important oil fields within the Arabian Peninsula and in fact into Iran and into Iraq. And so these are areas that are incredibly important in terms of the production of oil and the outlet of oil into the world market through oceanic transport. Now, the other points that I do want to make here are this feature right here, and this is in fact the Sinai Peninsula, and it divides Egypt from Israel and in fact from the Middle Eastern states along the Mediterranean. The other important ideas within this are the Dead Sea. You can see it right here, and in fact, the Jordan River. And again, the Jordan River is a remarkably small river, really, from a global standpoint, but it is very important in terms of water resources for these small states along the Mediterranean coast. The other important river systems are the Tigris and Euphrates complex that runs through this system here. And the Tigris and Euphrates, we'll see that in the next slide. A little didn't follow it very well there. But the Tigris and Euphrates are very important historically, and they remain important in terms of the agricultural productivity within the region. Lastly, I do want to point out the Zagros, which again are this backbone of mountains that run through here, north and east of the Arabian Peninsula. So again, these are many of the features that you'll often hear about in terms of the news, and now you can kind of see how they fit into the movements and the relationships of the region. I do want to point out one of the other, I guess we could call it physiographic features, but in a sense is really a geologic features, is the transformation of oil and natural gas in the region. I put this slide on because what this shows is kind of how the world saw oil reserves and natural gas when I started teaching this. So if we go back to about 2005, what we would see, I started teaching this class in 2000, and between 2000 and 2005, this is how the world saw oil and natural gas. And what you'll notice in this slide is that oil, in terms of proven reserves, there was an immense quantity. This is the Arabian Peninsula, and in fact the largest reserves in the world. Then we have a significant Central Russian fields here, to some degree the Baku oil fields there. And then you had some in Venezuela, and then of course, some in the southern Texas region here in Oklahoma region. But by and large, oil was concentrated in Southwest Asia and into Central Asia. And that put the rest of the world kind of under the influence or under the pressure from this region. And the same would have been true in terms of natural gas. You'll notice the largest natural gas reserves were also found in the Arabian Peninsula, and again, in fact, the Central Eurasian fields. And remember, from the Russian realm, this is in fact, in part, what was producing the conflict, and is producing the conflict in Ukraine, because this natural gas needed to get from there out into Europe. And so in that manner, natural gas from the region was very important. Now, this map has completely changed today. When we look at oil and gas reserves today, the development of hydraulic fracturing, fracking if you will, has fundamentally changed the map in terms of what is available reserves. Hydraulic fracturing has made this area, again, the Oklahoma, Texas region, the Dakotas, and as far as the Alberta gas fields here, and of course where we are, the Marcellus and Utica plays in the eastern part of the United States, the most robust and exploitable natural gas fields in the world. And that's changed how we relate to North Africa and Southwest Asia. No longer is there the same dynamics in terms of oil and gas in the world. And in fact, what is also very important to note is that hydraulic fracturing has changed the productivity of areas in the United States and in Canada. And so suddenly what was, to some degree, a monopoly of North Africa and Southwest Asia, with the additions of Nigeria, Indonesia, and Venezuela, is no longer the case. And so the world landscape of this natural resource has fundamentally changed. Not because the oil or gas has moved, but because our technology for extracting it has made new areas and new geologies available. Now, the other thing that we can then begin to talk about is the historical influence of North Africa and Southwest Asia. And what I want you to make sure you understand is the idea of culture hearths. And what we're going to talk about here, a major, in fact, one of the most important of the world's major culture hearths, is this one here that extends from the Nile Delta into the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. And this is perhaps the most important in terms of the Western cultural world. So the development of so many things that we take for granted today, in fact, happen in this culture hearth. Remember, culture hearth is an area of origin for technologies or cultural practices. So if you think about this region, and again, lower Nile Delta, the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, what we would call Mesopotamia today, extending from the Persian Gulf into the Levant along the Mediterranean coast, essentially was where Western culture developed agriculture. Most of our cereal grains can be tied, at least technologically, if not in terms of domestication, to this region. We also know that the evolution of writing, the development of writing in Western culture started here. Mathematics, the idea of number orders, developed here. The idea of seconds and minutes in terms of time developed here. Wheel technologies, the whole complex of wheel technology developed in this region. Now, somewhat less ideal, state warfare we really see as developing in this area, as well as the sail. Now, interestingly enough, also beer. Evidently, what we're seeing here is within the Mesopotamian Valley. This is one of the earliest records of people toasting with beer. And so, again, the development of cereal grains, the development of fermented grain beverages. Now, what comes out of then that culture hearth is a very complex, one of the first global, at least for the time, cultures, and that is the Persian Empire. And if you look at this, the extent of the Persian Empire, approximately 500 BCE, is an amazing extent across much of what is today Southwest Asia, in fact into South Asia, and into North Africa, an extremely large extent in terms of the Persian Empire. And some significant aspects of that culture remain today. So as you read again the history, think about first that layer of the Persian Empire. We can also see this area as a long history of articulating or interacting with water. And so again, as you read where people are, where they have been, think about water resources, and the population. People exist where there is water available. Remember I talked about the Jordan River, talked about the Tigris and Euphrates, we talk about the Maghreb and the Atlas Mountains and much of the runoff from that region. People congregate where there is water. In this region, that is extremely important. Now, I also want to talk about the cultural landscape here, and again, we need to talk about three major religions, world religions, that in fact developed in this area. Two of which are universalizing, meaning that their goal is to convert or capture culturally, philosophically, the world's population, and one that is ethnic. And so Christianity and Islam are considered universalizing religions. Judaism is considered an ethnic religion. All of which, however, essentially begin in Southwest Asia. Now, one of the things that I do want to point out is the idea of Islam, and a couple of important ideas. When did Islam start? Well, Islam started roughly in 570 with the birth of Muhammad. What we know is that Muhammad historically moved between a number of important cities within the region, city-states within the region, most notably Medina and Mecca. Although, again, at least in terms of the religious beliefs, he also moved to Jerusalem. Muhammad essentially had a lifespan of 570 to about 630 AD. Within that time, setting up the major tenets of Islam, as well as orally dictating the major work, religious work within that faith, the Quran. When we talk about Islam, like many of the world's religions, it has central tenets. And the easy way to understand Islam is in terms of what people often talk about as the 5 pillars, the 5 core aspects of the faith. The first one is an affirmation of the unity of God and the messenger being Muhammad. Okay, Shada. And I'm a terrible pronunciation in terms of my Arabic. Shada, again, affirmation. The second is prayer. It's a lot. And again, what we often, from the West, view is the idea of a explicit prayer within Islam. And that is prayer 5 times each day, the person, if possible, facing towards Mecca. Zakat, common to many religions, the idea of giving alms, a fixed or defined way of giving to the poor. Psalm, the idea of fasting, specific fasting, and in fact, of course, the month of Ramadan, central to the idea of fasting and purification. And then lastly, the Hajj. And again, not unique to Islam. We have pilgrimages in Christianity, we have pilgrimages in Buddhism, Hinduism, pilgrimages to sacred sites. Excuse me. But in Islam, central pilgrimage, if at all possible, is made once in a lifetime to Mecca. Now, it is important to note the significance of this in terms of Islamic culture. What you see here is Mecca, and this is the Kaaba, the sacred of sacreds. And what you are noticing here is during the Hajj, what you have here is people perambulating, that is walking repeatedly in circles around the Kaaba. And as they do that, the idea behind it is that all are equal in this space, rich, poor, educated, uneducated. But the pilgrimage is an act of unification within the culture. And it's a significant aspect of the culture. What is also important, though, today is to understand within Southwest Asia, in the Levant, is the intersection of these faiths in the city of Jerusalem. What you see here is the Western Wall, sacred, last remnants of the Temple Mount for the Jewish faith. You see the Dome of the Rock, a central piece of geography, holy location for the Islamic faith. And then you would also see, if you looked over, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Christian faiths traditionally believe that Jesus was buried. All of these existing within a single city, really within an area not much bigger than a square mile. That is the challenge. Now, Islam, and again, I'm going to focus somewhat on this because it is something that often people in this class are not familiar with. If we think about Islam, Islam expanded significantly during its early history. And what I want to point out here is, again, Mecca and Medina, please note where they are, it's worth understanding. These are the two holiest of cities, Mecca and Medina, within the Arabian Peninsula, the source of Islam. And then within its early movement, within the first period, the first 4 caliphates, first leaders after the death of Muhammad, you'll notice this expansion across the Persian Empire, across North Africa, as far as what is Libya today. Now, what is important is that, in fact, Islam, in its last kind of major push, expanded as far as the Pyrenees Mountains in Europe and no further. The Islamic Empire during these latter caliphates essentially ran into Orthodox Christianity in the Byzantine Empire and into the Frankish Empire in what is today Western Europe. And so Islam spread, ran into, and integrated to some degree with Western European cultures as well as South Asian cultures. In fact, expanding ultimately into the Mughal period within India. One of the things we often hear today is the question of Sunni versus Shia in Islam. And one of the ways that we can understand this is that Sunni Islam is often referred to as Orthodox Islam. Its followers are those that follow Abu Bakr, mostly the Gulf states, and this is also where the Wahhabist movement came out of, and unfortunately, Wahhabists are most often associated with Osama bin Laden, as well as with Al-Qaeda. Now, in contrast, the Shia, and the Shia follow the bloodline of Muhammad, the followers of Ali, who was a cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, are primarily concentrated in Iran. And this is one of the things that divides Iran, primarily Shia, Iraq, and the Iraq-Iran war was across Shia, Sunni divisions. And so, again, when you think about this, Iran is the center of Shia Islam, most of the rest of the Islamic world is Sunni, and to varying degrees. So major division, and largely along the lines of who came after Muhammad, who led the faith after Muhammad. Now, as we look again, I want to kind of put this out there in a broader landscape. What you'll notice here is the Shia areas, again, primarily associated with the Iranian state here. And then what we also see is this broad swath of Sunnism across the Arabian Peninsula, and again, throughout much of North Africa. But we also see in here different aspects. Again, you can see the Israeli state, Judaism here in Israel, and then areas of Christianity scattered within in terms of minor importance throughout the region. But again, the major divides, Sunni and Shia. What we can also see, again, if you look at the Sunni landscape, let's look at a bigger picture here. Sunni Islam, again, dominates much of the world. The one that I do want to point out is this. In fact, the most populous Islamic state is, in fact, Indonesia. And in fact, it follows the Sunni, the Shafi'i branch of Sunni Islam. And the Shia Islam is really fairly narrowly defined, although you do notice it right here, and that's becoming important in terms of the Yemeni conflict.